In this episode, we start by taking a security promise that people say quickly and then forget to prove, which is the promise that sensitive payment data is always protected while it moves. Data in transit is simply data traveling between two places, like a customer's device to a website, a cash register to a payment service, or an application server to a database, and those journeys happen constantly in modern systems. Beginners often assume that if something is inside a company building or inside a private network, it is automatically safe. But that assumption breaks down the moment you remember that networks are shared, systems are complex, and attackers love to hide in the middle of communication paths. In the payment card industry, PCI, world, protecting data in transit is not a luxury or an advanced feature. It is a baseline expectation because interception can expose cardholder data without ever breaking into a database. When you understand transit encryption as a habit that applies everywhere, you stop relying on luck and start relying on engineering. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. To make sense of this, it helps to define what we mean by encrypting data in transit, because the phrase can sound like a vague slogan. Encryption in transit means that while data is traveling over a network connection, it is transformed into unreadable ciphertext so that anyone who intercepts the traffic cannot understand it without the proper keys. The reason this matters is simple. Networks move information through many devices and paths, and not all of those paths are fully under your control, even inside your organization. When you send something without transit encryption, you are effectively trusting every device that forwards the traffic and every person or process that can observe it. In a PCI context, that trust is too generous because cardholder data and related sensitive information can be valuable to criminals and damaging to customers and businesses. Encrypting in transit reduces the chance that a quiet observer can steal data, and it also reduces the chance that data will be altered without detection. When learners internalize that transit encryption is about controlling who can learn the data, the goal becomes clearer. A major beginner misunderstanding is thinking that encryption in transit only applies to the moment a customer types in a card number, and everything after that is just internal plumbing. In reality, the primary account number, PAN, can travel across many internal and external connections depending on the architecture, and each hop is a chance for exposure if the hop is not protected. Even if the PAN is replaced by tokens early, other sensitive elements can still travel, such as authentication secrets, session identifiers, administrative credentials, and service-to-service authorization information. Those items may not look like card data, but they can be just as dangerous if intercepted because they can allow an attacker to impersonate users or systems and eventually reach the cardholder data environment, CDE. Encrypting data in transit everywhere means protecting not just the obvious payment submission moment, but every connection that can influence or expose sensitive systems and flows. This is why the phrase "every time" matters, because gaps tend to appear in less glamorous internal links where teams assume nobody is watching. Security works best when it is consistent in the boring places, not only in the public-facing ones. To understand why interception is realistic, you need a mental model of how attackers and accidents can sit between two communicating systems. A classic risk is an on-path observer, sometimes called a man-in-the-middle, where a device or service can see traffic as it passes through. That observer might be a compromised network device, a malicious wireless access point, a compromised endpoint, or an insider with access to network monitoring tools. Even without a villain, traffic can be captured unintentionally through troubleshooting captures, misconfigured monitoring, or logs that record network payloads. Beginners sometimes assume that because network equipment is owned by the organization, it is safe, but ownership does not prevent compromise or misuse. When data is encrypted in transit, the attacker's job becomes much harder because capturing the traffic no longer reveals the content. That does not solve every problem, but it removes a major class of easy wins for attackers and a major class of accidental exposures for defenders. The lesson is that transit encryption is a risk reduction tool that protects you even when other parts of the environment are imperfect. The most common technology pattern for transit encryption on modern networks involves transport layer security, TLS, which is the mechanism behind secure web connections and many secure service-to-service connections. The key idea is that TLS establishes a protected tunnel for a single session between two endpoints, using cryptography to provide confidentiality and to help ensure the endpoints are communicating as intended. Beginners do not need to memorize cryptographic algorithms to understand the high-level process, because what matters is the outcome. The two sides agree on encryption keys and then use those keys to protect the conversation. TLS also commonly relies on digital certificates to help a client verify that it is talking to the right server, which reduces the risk of being tricked into sending sensitive data to an imposter. When you hear that a site uses HTTPS, that is generally HTTP running over TLS, but the deeper point is that many non-web services can also use TLS in a similar way. If you can explain that TLS protects a conversation link and depends on correct endpoint identity and configuration, you are already thinking in the right direction. A critical part of encrypting in transit everywhere is remembering that the internet is not the only place where untrusted observation can occur, because internal networks can be risky too. Internal traffic can pass through shared switches, shared wireless networks, virtualized network layers, and monitoring infrastructure, and any of those can become an observation point if compromised or misused. Internal systems also often have higher privileges and wider access than external clients, which means that intercepted internal credentials can be even more damaging than intercepted customer traffic. In a PCI environment, internal connections might include application-to-database traffic, log forwarding traffic, replication traffic, backup traffic, administrative remote access, and integrations with service providers. Each of these connections can carry sensitive data or sensitive control signals, and treating them as safe because they are internal is a common reason encryption gaps persist. When the rule is encrypt everywhere, you reduce the need to debate whether a particular segment is trusted enough. You create consistency, and consistency reduces the chance that one overlooked internal link becomes the quiet leak that undermines everything else. It is also important to understand what end-to-end encryption means in practical architecture terms, because teams often confuse it with simply having some encryption somewhere. End-to-end is a claim about who can see the data, meaning the data remains encrypted from the true sender to the true receiver, with no intermediate system being able to read it. In many real designs, encryption is applied hop by hop, meaning each connection is encrypted but intermediate components can decrypt and re-encrypt, such as a proxy or a load balancer that terminates TLS and then starts a new encrypted connection to the backend. That can still be secure when designed carefully, but it changes the trust boundary because the terminating component becomes a place where plaintext exists. Beginners sometimes assume that if the browser shows a lock icon, the entire internal environment must be protected automatically, but the lock icon only describes the connection between the client and the first server endpoint it sees. If sensitive data continues deeper, you must ensure the internal connections are protected as well, especially if the first endpoint is not the final system that needs the data. Thinking in terms of where plaintext exists helps you decide where encryption must continue, and it keeps your design honest. Another common misunderstanding is believing that a virtual private network, VPN, automatically means you do not need application-level transit encryption. A VPN can encrypt a network path, and it can be helpful for remote access and site-to-site connectivity, but it does not replace the need for protecting sensitive application traffic in a consistent, verifiable way. VPNs can be misconfigured, can be bypassed, and can create broad trust zones that allow many kinds of traffic once connected, which can increase risk if not tightly controlled. Application-level transit encryption, like TLS, protects the specific connection between the communicating systems regardless of what the underlying network path looks like. For payment security, that means even if a VPN exists, encrypting sensitive flows at the application or service layer provides stronger defense in depth. Beginners sometimes want one single protective layer to do everything, but good security uses layered controls so that if one layer weakens, the others still protect the data. When you can explain VPNs as helpful but not sufficient, you are more likely to build architectures that hold up under real-world complexity. Service providers introduce another reason the encrypt everywhere mindset matters, because data often crosses organizational boundaries in ways that are easy to underestimate. A payment gateway, a hosting provider, a managed security provider, or a support vendor can be part of the data flow or part of the administrative access path into systems that matter. Shared responsibility means you must know which connections exist, what data they carry, and whether those connections are encrypted all the way through the handoff. For example, an application programming interface, API, call to a provider might carry transaction details, tokens, authorization information, or operational metadata, and that call must be protected in transit so it cannot be intercepted on the path. Even if the provider claims strong security, you still need your side to be configured correctly, because encryption is a two-endpoint agreement, not a one-sided promise. Beginners sometimes treat provider links as automatically secure because they are professional services, but professional services still rely on correct configuration and correct validation. When you treat external links as first-class parts of your encryption story, you reduce seams where data can leak during transit. It is also worth focusing on the idea of strong cryptographic configuration at a high level, because encrypting in transit is not only about turning encryption on, but about ensuring it is not weakened by outdated protocols or poor choices. Over time, older cryptographic methods become less safe as computing power increases and new attack techniques are discovered, which is why standards and best practices evolve. Beginners do not need to memorize specific cipher names to understand that using modern, well-regarded configurations matters, and that legacy settings can quietly undermine the protection you think you have. Another factor is certificate management, because certificates help systems identify each other, and expired or mismanaged certificates can lead teams to bypass validation just to keep systems running. That bypass behavior is dangerous because it trains systems and people to accept unsafe connections. A disciplined approach treats certificate and protocol hygiene as part of the encryption control, not as an annoying maintenance task. When encryption is strong and consistently managed, it remains a reliable barrier rather than a fragile feature. Encrypting in transit everywhere also includes the parts of the environment that people rarely think of as data transfer, such as administrative access and management traffic. When administrators connect to systems, they often transmit credentials, commands, and sensitive system information, and if that traffic is not encrypted, an observer could steal access or learn details that make later attacks easier. Management traffic can also involve configuration changes and secrets that unlock additional systems, which means compromise of management traffic can compromise far more than one device. For PCI environments, this matters because administrative pathways often lead directly into the CDE or into systems that can impact the CDE, making them high-value targets. Beginners sometimes assume that administrative access is protected because only trusted people use it, but trust does not prevent interception or endpoint compromise. Encrypting admin sessions and ensuring secure channels for management connections reduces the chance that privileged control signals can be observed or altered in transit. When you include management traffic in the encrypt everywhere rule, you close a class of gaps that otherwise remain quietly open. A related concept is that encryption must be paired with careful thinking about where sensitive data should and should not appear, because encryption is not a license to move sensitive data everywhere. If your architecture can avoid sending the PAN through internal systems by using tokenization early, that reduces both scope and transit exposure because fewer links ever carry the most sensitive value. Even when encrypted, moving full card numbers through many systems increases the number of endpoints that could leak or mishandle the data, because endpoints must briefly process plaintext. Encrypting in transit protects against interception, but it does not automatically protect against poor endpoint security, overly broad access, or accidental storage in logs. Beginners sometimes treat encryption as a universal safety net, but it is best combined with minimization so that you encrypt what must travel and you eliminate what does not need to travel. This mindset creates a cleaner data flow map where sensitive elements have a short, controlled path rather than a long tour through the enterprise. When you connect encryption to minimization, Your decisions become more strategic and less reactive. Proof and validation matter here just as much as design, because PCI expects you to show that encryption in transit is not only intended but consistently in place. Proof involves being able to explain where sensitive data travels, which connections carry it, and how you know those connections are protected. Beginners often think proof is a single statement like we use encryption, but real proof aligns with your data flow mapping and shows that encryption is applied at each relevant boundary, including internal service links and provider handoffs. It also includes being able to explain how you prevent drift, such as a new service being deployed without secure settings or an old integration falling back to an insecure mode during troubleshooting. Validation is also about recognizing exceptions, like a legacy component that cannot support modern encryption, and ensuring that such exceptions are handled with compensating controls and do not quietly become the default. When your proof story is consistent, it becomes much harder for gaps to hide. The habit of validating encryption regularly is what turns the slogan "everywhere" every time into an operational reality. Finally, it helps to connect transit encryption to the broader idea of trust boundaries, because encryption is one of the clearest ways to mark where trust is earned rather than assumed. When two endpoints authenticate each other properly and establish an encrypted channel, they are explicitly agreeing on who is involved and how the conversation is protected. That explicit agreement is far safer than relying on the hope that nobody is listening on the network. In a payment environment, where the CDE must be protected and where scope must be defensible, encryption in transit becomes part of the boundary evidence, showing that sensitive flows are treated as sensitive regardless of where they occur. Beginners sometimes learn security as a set of separate topics, but transit encryption ties together data flow mapping, segmentation, access control, service provider governance, and configuration management into one cohesive outcome. When every sensitive link is encrypted, the environment becomes harder to observe, harder to manipulate, and easier to defend. That is the practical meaning of doing it everywhere, every time. By the end of this lesson, the key takeaway is that encrypting data in transit is not a single checkbox, but a consistent design principle that protects sensitive information as it moves through complex, changing systems. You protect against interception by ensuring that each link carrying sensitive data or sensitive control signals uses strong, modern encryption, commonly through TLS, and you avoid false comfort from assumptions like internal networks are safe or VPNs replace application-level protection. You think carefully about where plaintext exists, how endpoints are identified through certificates, and how service provider boundaries are secured so shared responsibility does not create gaps. You also pair encryption with minimization so that the most sensitive values travel as little as possible, and you validate continuously so drift and exceptions do not undermine your protection. When you can explain where data travels, why each connection must be encrypted, and how you know the protection is consistently in place, you have the kind of disciplined, evidence-driven understanding that PCI expects and that real payment security demands.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.